Welcome to Full Prefrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive function. This podcast is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. So join us as we explore executive function and the science of learning. And now, here's your host, the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.
Welcome to Full Prefrontal, where we expose the mysteries of executive function and talk about personal success, personal agency, how do we become goal-oriented and persist towards goals in an enlightened self-interest way, not in a selfish way. And executive function is the driving force that allows you to manage your behaviors, thoughts, actions, emotions, so that you can produce results for yourself that benefit you, but that benefit everyone else around you. However, this is not intuitive, as we have talked a lot about. And today I'm going to have a very special guest, Dr. Camille Farrington, who is going to really unveil the secrets to student success. But before I talk to you about that, I thought I'll share a quick story about my own personal journey of becoming an effective student. I grew up in India, and my K-12 and my undergraduate degrees and one master's degrees was in India. And one of the approaches that was very evident was brutal honesty regarding student performance. So I was telling this story to somebody, but when I was growing up, the teachers would display the marks that you get on the door. And so of course the marks were ranked by the highest with the name and the lowest, pass, fail. And of course the fail all would be in red. I cannot tell you, I never was in the last category, always would be the top one or two. And I cannot tell you, I felt the same pain as the people who were in red. And one of the things, as I remember as a ninth grader thinking, why are teachers doing that? That was quite painful. But I think they were thinking this will motivate kids to never be on the list, so to speak. But it was never this list never did the job that it was supposed to do, or they thought it will do. And it became the most sore point in everybody's. So not only your classmates knew, but any Tom, Dick, and Harry that passed by the class knew. So the reason I'm sharing that is some of the approaches in dealing and excavating the skills and talents in young people is misunderstood, and the efforts that people make may be misguided. And that's why I'm very curious and keen to talk to a very special guest today. And welcome Dr. Camille Farrington. She is a senior research associate and director of the Equitable Learning and Development Group at the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research. Her work focuses on understanding learning environments as constructed developmental spaces in the context of systematic racism and inequity. She seeks to understand how young people make sense of daily schooling experiences, as I just shared mine, and how school structures and teachers practices shape student beliefs, behaviors, identities, performance, and development, which is such a profound ways to conceptualize education. She's also a primary investigator for Equitable Learning and Development Project, Next System Learning Collaborative, and Building Equitable Learning Environments, which is also known as BELLE, BELLE. Network, and she collaborates with educators, scholars, students, families to reimagine and transform public education, which is so needed. And finally, there are two seminal reports that I have benefited tremendously, and my audience, if you haven't, we'll be linking those in our show notes. But her publications include Foundations for Young Adult Success, a developmental framework that was published in 2015, and Teaching Adolescents to Become Learners, the Role of Non-Cognitive Factors in Shaping School Performance, which was published in 2012. So with that, I know there's one amazing element, which I'll ask you as a question, but welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm doing well, Sucheta. Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So your journey as a teacher, which is the piece that I'm very interested. Before you became a researcher, you were a high school teacher, I understand, and you spent over 15 years or close to 15 years teaching youth. And so, what are the teaching and learning barriers you encountered that informed your research perspective?
That's a great question. So I taught in three different states. I started in Oakland, California, and taught there for 2 years. Then moved with my husband to Madison, Wisconsin, a very different place from Oakland, and taught outside of Madison in a small district with one high school in Wisconsin, and then moved to Chicago and taught in Chicago. So three very different contexts with very different groups of students. But the thing that I saw over and over really was that a lot of what was most challenging was not students or their learning. It was the structure of school in which I was trying to teach. And so I think that's what eventually led me back to go back to school and to become a researcher, was thinking more broadly about the systemic conditions and structures in which we're asking young people to learn, and what can we do to try to create better context to support young people's learning and development.
And it's totally our gain. Those few students may have lost you as a teacher, but you have profoundly influenced the way educators need to conceptualize educating the youth. So I want to start with the framework that particularly the first research paper, that teaching adolescents to become learners, and where you talk about non-cognitive factors. And so interesting because from where I sit and where I come from, my training, we would not describe them as non-cognitive skills. So I'm very curious to first talk about, and in this paper, I think you describe factors such as persistence, resilience, grit, goal setting, help-seeking, cooperation, conscientiousness, self-efficacy, self-control, self-discipline, and so on and so forth, mindsets. So tell us a little bit about, first, the definition of non-cognitive functions, and is it a uniquely placed in the context, or to juxtapose in the context of education? Because in education, we are talking about academic learning, which requires cognitive abilities.
Right. And so that paper, as you said, that paper was published in 2012, and at that point in time, the phrase non-cognitive skills was very hot topic.
I see.
And we were asked actually to do a review on non-cognitive skills. And so that term non-cognitive has always kind of stuck, not sat well with me, because I think that, as I've often said in presenting this work, that the only thing non-cognitive about human beings is when they're dead. That every
exactly
like every aspect of everything we do is a combination of our cognition and our emotion and our spirit and our physical energy, and that you can't really separate those things out. So in that way, I think non-cognitive is a pretty horrible word. But where it came from was distinguishing between things that could be measured by cognitive tests and things that could not be measured by cognitive tests. And I think that the phrase developed because it was saying like, okay, well, we know that cognitive differences as tested by cognitive tests don't account for some of the differences in life outcomes that we see for people. So it must therefore be, quote, non-cognitive things that contribute, that make these differences. And so that's where the term came from. But as you say, it's actually not a very good term, and anybody who understands human development would know that that's not a very good term. And since 2012, I have pretty much never used it in describing those things.
So So I appreciate that distinction, because I think and I can draw such a parallel with executive function. So executive function, as you know, is goal setting, prioritization process, your organization planning skills, your ability to think about the future, perspective taking. None of these skills are measured in the academic context, but the entire academic success, which heavily depends on self-management, requires these abilities. And I do want to also ask you now, the new term social emotional learning has become an avalanche of a term that is completely burying executive function once again. So before it was non-cognitive, and now it's this social emotional learning. So just to kind of finish up that thought about that particular research, there were a lot of key questions that you all had raised, which is what are these factors that are associated with academic performance, and what is the relationship between these factors, the teaching process, and the outcome that we see? So can you share the results you found, this deep research that you did before you set out to do the measurement? So talk to us about that.
Yes, and your point about social emotional learning or non-cognitive, I think that a danger of a catch-all phrase is that we think that everything in that bucket is somehow the same or similar. And I think in both cases that it contains many different kinds of things. Yes. that are important to differentiate, because how they're developed, how they're measured, how they matter differs from one thing to another. So the first thing we did in this work in 2012 was to say, well, what are the different kinds of things that fall under this umbrella of non-cognitive factors? We refuse to use the word skills, because they aren't all skills. Some of them are things that are innate, some are abilities, contextual, right? So we substituted in the word factors just as a kind of a vague term that could apply to a lot of different kinds of things. And so the 5 things that we identified that contributed to academic performance, but that aren't tested by cognitive tests. First are academic behaviors, academic perseverance, academic mindsets, learning strategies, and social skills. And then for each of those 5 different kinds of things, we looked to see, well, first of all, like what's the definition of these things? What's the evidence that they're related to students' academic performance? Are they malleable? Do we know how to change them? Because things can be malleable, and yet we don't actually know how to intentionally impact them. So we were looking for evidence. Are they malleable? Do we know how to change them in schools? And then we are also really interested in disparities of academic performance by gender and by race. And so we also asked the question, is there evidence that if you could further develop any one of those 5 categories, would it eliminate differences by race and gender? So in other words, do they operate differentially, or is there evidence that boys versus girls has more of one or the other, for example? And so we applied those 5 questions to those 5 categories. And also we were really interested in the relationships between those 5 categories. So how do mindsets affect learning strategies, or how do social skills affect behaviors, and trying to see the evidence of how these things were put together. Because one thing that became really clear as we were looking through all of this is that the folks who study belonging don't talk to the people who study grit, who don't talk to the people who study executive function, who don't talk to the people, who study, interpersonal empathy or something. So we also wanted to see where could we draw on existing research to understand how those things might be connected.
I think I can say when I started this podcast, that was one of the biggest goals I had is to really show the intersectionality between neuroscience, cognitive psychology, psychology, education, anthropology, social cognition. And what I found that when we are talking about fundamentally how people learn to learn, there has to be some emphasis given to self-knowledge. And secondly, those who are in charge of other people learning by following the lead, there has to be some onus on the people who are delivering the learning to understand the impact or the mindset, as you were saying, or strategic development, like how do I become strategic thinking? And lastly, I'll say what was so shocking to me, since I come from a place where we work with, my area of expertise was brain injuries, concussions. And one of the frameworks there is impairment and skill building. So if you lack the ability and skill because there was a setback, then how do you develop them? And I found that their same principles are not at all used in normal learning circumstances. So strategic learning is in this side somewhere, and teaching people who don't have any impairment, they're not teaching strategic learning at all. And that gap to me was and so the first time through your framework, I found all factors of human condition are addressed in such a profound ways. And I really congratulate you and your team for doing such a beautiful job. And so can we take a minute and maybe you can walk us through what are you seeing if we want to improve students' academic performance? What can we change in the way we address development of academic behaviors, development of academic persistence, developing the mindsets? Because as you mentioned, the same dilemma I see in the psychology field, where character and personality, nobody touches it because you are wired or whatever. So sorry for this long rambling, but I would love to see how you want people to be informed by this research.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk about that. So one thing to just say about that particular study is that we were trying to understand what created academic performance as measured by students' grades in classes. And so that was a kind of a narrow outcome. We were looking specifically at academic performance. In subsequent work, we looked more broadly at young people's development. But if you focus in on just what makes for better academic performance, that was the primary question that was in front of us for the work in 2012. And so one thing that we know for sure is pretty clear is you can't improve academic performance, grades in classes, unless you change behaviors. So student behaviors, academic behaviors such as coming to school, paying attention, studying, turning in work, participating in discussions, like that is the way that students produce grades, at least in the way our normal grading system works.
Structured, yeah.
And so whatever you do has to improve young people's actual behaviors if it's going to show up as academic performance. They might learn things, but you wouldn't know it if they aren't engaged in the behaviors that then show what they've learned. And so behaviors are a critical thing to change. But it's really hard to change behaviors directly just by trying to get people to act differently. And so you have to kind of, I think about it as move kind of farther upstream to think about, well, what shapes behaviors? And tied into the idea of behaviors is this idea of perseverance. And perseverance expresses itself through behaviors. So if you're very persistent at something, we see that you keep trying, or you keep working on something despite setbacks or despite barriers. And so that trying to support young people to be more persistent or perseverant in their work is kind of the goal of every teacher. They as a teacher, I know that when you see young people give up, you want to figure out, okay, how can I get, like, this student's giving up, this student's keeping at it. How do I get the student who's giving up to want to keep working at something? And there again, cajoling them or shaming them or punishing them or trying to incentivize them just to act different or to keep working at something doesn't get you very far. And so we have to keep going farther backstream. So what farther upstream, what contributes to young people being persistent and to engage persistently in good behaviors? And that's where we start getting to some really interesting things. And what we found was that there's kind of a why and a how that contribute to perseverance. The why is, why am I engaged in this in the first place? Like, why do I want to do this? What are the motivational factors for this? And then the how is, do I know how to engage? And if I don't know how to do something, then I might really want to, but I can't make progress because I just don't know how to do it. So paying attention to both, are we setting up do students feel the things that would motivate them to want to do work? And do they know how to do that? And so we call those academic mindsets, or the why pieces. And then learning strategies are the how pieces. And I'll start with learning strategies, which is straightforward. Learning strategies are learned behaviors. They're not innate. We don't come onto the planet knowing them. It's learning, being explicitly taught how to do something, or strategies for retaining, like, how do I read something and then remember the key ideas of this? There's strategies for doing that teachers can teach to students, and that they can get better at doing that through learned strategies. But the academic mindsets are not things that you can teach somebody. What we found was that you have to kind of create the conditions that make those academic mindsets true. And in that report, we talked about 4 mindsets for which there's, at the time in 2012, was a lot of evidence around. And subsequent to that, in the last 9 years, there's been more and more evidence to support the importance of these 4 mindsets. And we talked about them in the first person, from the point of view of the learner. And the first is belonging. I belong in this academic community. And if I feel like I belong in this community, then I'm motivated to do the kinds of things that connect me to other people in this community and keep me connected, and that honor those relationships. So if I feel connected to my teacher, then I want to do something that makes the teacher feel positive towards me. And if I feel connected to my classmates, and part of what we do as being a community of learners is that we help each other learn, then I want to engage in that kind of behavior because I belong here and I feel good to be connected to the people in my community, in my learning community. And so that motivates me to work hard at things. It motivates me to stick with things, to try and master things that are difficult. So I belong in this academic community is the first really important mindset. And then this a second, and these are actually in no particular order, a second mindset is self-efficacy. And we phrase that as I believe I can succeed at this. And this is a true fact about any human being. We don't invest energy in things that we don't think we can be successful in. And that's smart of us because we only have so much energy. And there's a lot of things that demand our attention. And if something right off the bat seems hopeless, like this is an impossible task, then we withhold our energy from it. So believing that we can succeed is foundational to us wanting to invest energy and time in something. And so that notion that I can succeed at this is a really critical mindset. A third one is growth mindset. And I know you talked to David Yeager about growth mindset. And so the idea that my ability and competence will grow with my effort. It's not something that's limited and that there's a fixed end to. And so that's really important for when young people hit up against what feels like the edge of what they're able to do. If they interpret that edge as, okay, well, I've hit the ability of my, the limits of my ability, then it doesn't make any sense to keep pushing because, I've gone as far as I can. But if you really believe that that sense of a pushing up against an edge is the place where if you really lean in, you can get better. And that's in fact how you develop yourself. Then when you get to that edge, you're going to lean in instead of lean back. And so believing that my ability, my competence are going to grow with my effort at the place where it's hardest for me is again is a belief, a mindset that motivates perseverance and good behaviors. And then the fourth of the mindsets is relevance. This work has meaning to me.
Love that.
And again, I think every adult can appreciate when you're asked to do, whether it's in a job or in some kind of a setting where you're asked to do something that you think is worthless or meaningless, it's really infuriating to have to do something that doesn't hold any personal meaning to us. And in fact, cognitively, we can't force ourselves to pay attention to things that aren't interesting to us. We literally cannot force ourselves to attend to things that have no interest to us. And so seeing work as meaningful, understanding that engaging in this is going to be rewarding for something that we care about, again, is a motivating belief that gets us to persist, that gets us to engage, to lean in when things are hard, and to pick up again when we don't do well the first time. So those four mindsets are just really, really critical energy or fuel to motivate persistence and perseverance towards goals. And that's true in any kind of goal, but it's absolutely tied to academic performance.
Thank you for spending a minute on that. So critical. And what I love the distinction there when you talk about the four mindset, a growth mindset is part of it because, or rather, growth mindset is not the entire set of mindsets.
Right.
Because I think I'm seeing another little, we all tend to be like really leaning towards what's popular and hip and whatever seems to be top of the cultural mind, so to speak. And growth mindset is something I hear a lot, and people are talking explicitly about teaching growth mindset by talking about growth mindsets. And one distinction that your work and your ongoing work talks about, these are inculcated through being. And at the heart of that is action and reflection. So can you talk a little bit about that as even parents maybe, but educators or teaching institutes such as classrooms and schools, or maybe entire districts or whole U.S. educational system thinks about these, just the aspect of mindsets. How can we cultivate an environment where these mindsets are self-evident, right? That's how they need to be, because you cannot tell a kid to become that with that mindset. So talk to us about, because this gets lost sometimes. I find that there's too much of a cliched versions, putting posters on the wall when the teacher doesn't even address failures as a normalizing failure is not even part of the classroom environment. But then they're saying, pick yourself up.
Right. That's exactly right. And yeah, mindsets cannot be taught. So unlike learning strategies, which have to be taught, yes, mindsets cannot be taught. They can only be fostered. And so, and if we think of mindsets as beliefs that a young person, or that any excuse me, if we think of mindsets as a belief that a human being holds about themselves, about other people, and about the world, and it's how we interpret our experience, and mindsets become, I'll say, is for that mindsets become automated because once we start believing something, we continue to believe it unless something interrupts that belief and kind of makes us reconsider that. And so the things that, so the environment, like if we hold it as a belief, and what I say to educators all the time, it's easier to believe something if it's true. And so if you create an environment in which it is true that your ability and competence will grow with your efforts. So for example, if you do work that falls short of what the teacher expects, and then the teacher just puts a grade on it and moves on to something else, that doesn't help you cultivate the idea that if I keep working on this thing, I'll get better at this thing. And so giving students the opportunity to develop competence in something, not just grading the competence they currently have, helps to cultivate that mindset that my ability and competence will grow with my effort. Likewise, I belong in this learning community if I'm in a place where people are mean to each other, and that is okay and let's stand as a norm, or that people get ostracized or treated differently depending on who they are, then it's hard to believe that I belong in this place because I'm always on alert that something's going to happen to me. And so again, if you can cultivate an environment in which people actually care about each other, actually are happy to see each other, understand and get to know each other, like that's the kind of place where people start to feel like maybe they really belong. I'm thinking back, Sucheta, about your story about the list on the door of the ratings of all the students. And I'm thinking about the mindset about I can succeed at this. For students who perennially show up on the very bottom of that list, it's pretty hard to believe that next time I'm going to be at the top of that list. And so young people are always looking for clues and hints about what's the likelihood that I'll be successful here. And so again, if we set up an environment for their learning that makes it true that in fact they can succeed. And again, that's like giving more opportunities if they didn't succeed the first time. It's setting up the rules so that it's not, grading on a curve, and that kind of thing. Then all of those conditions really make it possible to believe the mindsets. And again, like relevance, this work is meaningful, understanding what students care about and trying to connect the work that they're doing to things they care about in the world, things going on in the world, things, knowledge that they bring into the classroom. Again, all of that makes those mindsets just a lot easier to believe.
The story there, as you're saying, is children are likely to gauge beliefs through demonstration of demonstration of it. And as adults, if they are valuing, like the way I think about the display of the marks, to them, I know one value as our school valued was brutal honesty. They felt it is what it is. But to me, that was an emblematic of fixed mindset that children are like rolling dice. Sometimes you get both a die showing 6. Sometimes you just get 1. So there was no sense of agency built into that. There was no sense of value built into it. There was brutal honesty that you suck, and I'm sorry to inform you, you suck.
Right.
And the caveat there being, it's up to you, where the teacher and the schooling institution took no responsibility. And I'm being facetious here because I also learned many, many wonderful things, but I just never understood this little piece of it. But there was, and I've seen many parts of Indian upbringing and even here, I guess, but there's some brutal honesty being at the heart of telling the bad news of you sucking as a way to motivate you.
Right. And that actually, and it can be motivating for some people if some of the other things are in place. So like I've heard many, many stories of people who persisted at something to prove somebody else wrong who told them they couldn't do it. Right. So if you care about the thing, if there's some kind of thing that motivates you, that you care about, then you can press through that. But it's not a good bet for me. Like it doesn't work for a lot of students, and particularly for students who don't see the value in engaging in the work in the first place. Then being told that you're at the bottom of the heap is not actually a motivating thing at all.
and that is not a relationship with failure, because I work with children and adolescents and adults who are struggling. One fundamental my lesson to them is learning by definition is not knowing. So to you, not knowing is default. And if you not know, you're not going to know. So not knowing is not same as doing poorly. And that's the real distinction to help children understand. Doing poorly is lacking effort, lacking commitment, lacking skills. But all of those parts are learnable. And so if you frame it that way, I think that can really help children tremendously. So the second part, I wanted to quickly see where you saw, where does student agency fit in these 5 factors that you describe? And particularly as you read must have read the article by Pedro Noguera and Anindya Kundu as a response to Angela Duckworth's article about grit, that children from poverty and children from low socioeconomic background, they may be blamed to have less grit, but they just lack the opportunity and that distinction. And so would you take a minute to also see how these factors shape out differently based on the socioeconomic disparities in this country?
Yeah, no. So I think that if we think about mindsets, those 4 mindsets are powerful regardless of who you are. But your likelihood to develop those mindsets, or put another way, the likelihood of the environment to support you to develop those mindsets is going to be different depending on your social identities. In some, it might be different depending on your social identities, and in schools, generally speaking, it is different. And in the intervention research around mindsets, what findings consistently come out to be is that mindset interventions sometimes don't make any difference for white students, but make a big difference for Black students, or depending on the context, for female students. So if you're in a stereotypically male discipline, then female students would be the ones who benefited the most from a mindset intervention. For example, the notion of, do I belong here? Interventions that help students reframe their experience in a way that reaffirms their belonging, that those kinds of interventions have big impacts on female students in traditionally male disciplines, or on Black or Latino students in academic areas that we hear a lot about, quote unquote, racial achievement gaps. So the notion that that a long history of Black and Latinx students as not being intellectual, for example, not having intellectual capacities equal to white or Asian students, like those stereotypes are pervasive, and it's in the air, as Claude Steele says, and so it informs their beliefs that they can be successful, for example. So, but I want to bring this back to the question about agency. And so I think a goal of education broadly, and in the work that we did in 2015 around the Foundations for Young Adult Success, we said that the goals of education should be young people's agency, development of agency, development of socially valued competencies, and an integrated identity. And so if we think of academic learning, on one hand, academic learning in school contributes to our socially valued competencies because we have then academic competencies that we can utilize in all kinds of different contexts. But academic competencies shouldn't come at the expense of agency or identity. We want all of those things to grow together. And so we want young people to feel not only that they have these skills, but that they're able to use them in a way that advances their goals, the goals of their community, things that they see need to be changed in the world. All of that as that the point of gaining skills is so that you can engage in the world in a way that moves things. And then identity piece is critically important as well. You want people to feel whole and healthy and to understand who they are, where they came from, and to be able to hold pride in that. And so again, we don't want to denigrate people's identities at the cost of trying to build their competencies. So those things really kind of need to work in tandem. And agency, again, if we want people to grow up, go through school, and then be agentic adults, then we have to give them opportunities to exercise agency all the way through their lives, right? Yes. At the appropriate level, 3-year-olds can exercise agency, 10-year-olds can exercise agency. It looks different from what a 24-year-old would do, but there has to be multiple opportunities for people to exercise agency and express and explore their identities at the same time as they're developing their competencies.
It's a funny story, if you allow me to indulge in a sidebar here, but I was at a friend's place, and she has a 12-year-old and 9-year-old, and the kids after lunch came to mom to ask, can they have candy and how much? So there was like a Smarties, and this all transpired in front of me, and I just asked her, why are they asking you? So then she proceeded to say 2. And then the other kid wanted not Smarties, but something else. And they asked how many. And then she said, if it's a larger than 1, whatever the math she had. And and I just asked her, why are you deciding this? And she was taken aback, and she said, what do you mean? I said, they're 9 and 12. Like, why can't they decide what they can have? Well, but I don't want them to eat, candy can be bad. So I said, don't keep it in their house. Like, agency is to be able to decide what's good for me and what's not good for me. But if you're so concerned that they can't even decide, so even that simple sliver, like, I find that the teachers are deciding how much work they need to do. The students do not have the autonomy to start with the hardest, come to the, or like one of the things altering the homework policy, even for the kid who has dysgraphia, could be a simple thing that these are 5 very important, important problems, but 10 I'm giving you so you get more practice. Now, the agency can be that as long as you tackle the 5 most important problems, additional practice I allow you based on the time it takes you. Now, this becomes, the student becomes agent of their own learning, right?
Right.
And so that brings me to this question then, talking about the way we prepare our educators. How do we build the capacities of the teacher workforce to deliver the kind of transformative educational experiences for adolescents that you are advocating for? You're talking about these very, very powerful internal mechanisms that need to be activated, I feel, at different junctures of their development. But if the teachers don't show a psych-wise or knowledge of these complex components, which is not necessarily part of their training either, how do you see that change for us?
So it's interesting. So if we think for a minute about what we were just talking about for young people, and we said that what drives them to do their best work and their best learning is creating an environment that makes these mindsets true and that moves them towards agency, an integrated identity, and a set of socially valued competencies. And the exact same thing is true for adults. The thing that's going to motivate them to do their best work, like we have to start with the assumption that actually anybody's capable of anything. And so young people are capable of doing anything put in front of them. And it's a question of setting up the circumstances and providing the supports that allow that to be possible. And I believe the same is true of adults and adults working in schools or working in any setting, that if you set up the circumstances and the conditions that support them to do their best work, and it would be the same kind of mindsets. I belong in this community. My work is an integral part of what we're trying to do here. I believe we can be successful at this, and I believe I can be successful at this.
Yeah.
And so, like, what are the things that are barriers to adults' success as being educators or supporting young people? And oftentimes it's structural things. Like I know as a high school teacher, I would have 160 students a day. It was really hard to develop deep relationships with 160 students a day when I saw them for 45 minutes of very scripted kind of time. So like, how might we restructure things? And schools are considering these questions and trying to think about how do we restructure adults' work so that they have more time to actually build relationships with young people, and feeling like the work is meaningful and relevant. Again, I think a lot of teachers, particularly when we saw the shift towards tested skills, and like that your job just has to be to improve these test scores, and we're going to do these drills, and that was demoralizing for a lot of teachers, and they didn't feel like their work was meaningful, nor did they feel like it was necessarily possible for them to be successful. All of that's really demotivating for the adults. So again, how do we set up the conditions so that they feel belonging, they feel self-efficacy, they feel the relevance of the work, and the growth mindset idea that they believe that collectively, particularly, that if we work on this together, we can create a different kind of environment. We can change the trajectory of students' lives, and that like, what would it take? What would the structures need to be for that to be true? And so I think if we approach adult development from that frame, and again, valuing adults' identity and their identity development and developing their agency, how much control do we give over to them? Because I think your example with the mother and the candy and the child is very much oftentimes how adult educators who are professionals
Yes.
still are told, like, you will do this, you will spend this much time with it. Like, there's very little agency they have over their own time and decision making. So I think we have to apply the exact same understanding about human development for the adults in school settings or any kind of work setting that works with youth.
I'm going to ask you this last question, which kind of sums up your big overarching ideas. But you talk about that most people who are interested in success of the young ones that they're either raising or guiding or teaching, and what they want most is much broader range of outcomes, not just college and career readiness. It's not like, can you go to college and take a test, but they, as I've heard you talk about and write about, is this support kids to become these healthy and happy individuals who eventually they themselves become the ones who create stable families and navigate the social institutions or advocate for themselves and advocate for their loved ones, those are dependent on them, maintain vitality, and even become enterprising. So to do all that, we all have to get this right. So what do you think about the broadening the goals of education beyond academic skills is to prepare such kind of individuals, and this is a positive development in that direction. But is there anything that the social emotional advocates have gotten wrong as they are? First of all, I don't think they're defining the development in such broad sense, but what are they not getting right? And it's really frustrating, honestly, between you and I, that so much of there was recently something I came across was 6-minute SEL or something, and how do you even accomplish these deep, value-based, internalized ways of being in on a flyby shooting kind of mode,
Mm-hmm.
So what advice do you have for all of us?
Yeah, well, I think you put your finger on it in some way. That the going back to what we were talking about at the very beginning of our conversation about broad categories like social emotional learning, and then thinking that everything that we bucket under that category is the same kind of phenomenon as the next thing under that category. And so, as we were talking before, learning strategies is something that you can teach, but academic mindsets is not something you can teach. So it's something that you need to foster by setting up the conditions that are going to bring that forth in young people. And so I think that some social emotional learning advocates who thinks really specifically around skills and social emotional skills, and think of those as taught things, like things that are taught and learned. And so, yeah, there's a 6-minute, skill lesson. That's all well and good as a small piece of what it means to develop as a social and emotional being, because part of our social emotional lives are learned skills. But there are huge other parts that are not learned skills. And so understanding that it's not as simple as lessons where we're going to teach a thing. And then the other piece is to understand the developmental trajectory of young people, that things that you would teach explicitly to little kids, as they're first developing. So if we think of executive functions and self-regulation in preschool age children, that there we really are going to teach specific things. We're going to model, we're going to kind of show what we mean about sharing, and we're going to set rules around those things. But as young and in elementary school, there's good reason to teach really explicit skills about how do you make a friend and how do you work with a group. And those are things that can be aided by having particular skills and strategies. But once young people start moving into middle school and high school, the thing that really comes to the fore is their identity development and their understanding of how do they fit in with the world, and how are they making meaning of their experience? How are they coding their place in the world, what the world is like, how that all fits together. And there you can't teach them anything. In fact, the more you try to teach adolescents something explicitly, the less they're gonna think that's a valuable thing. So it really is important, if we think about supporting the social emotional development of young people, that we shift our tactics over time to recognize the developmental stages that young people are in at different times, and to kind of work with their natural developmental tasks of early adolescence and later adolescence. So, for example, helping young people to reflect on their identities. What kind of people do they want to be? what kinds of world do they want to live in? What are the values that they really hold? What are different kinds of values that different people hold, and what kinds of conflicts come up in that, and how do we resolve those? Like, all of those questions are not something you can, it's not a skill you can teach. It's a opportunities for reflection, for having experiences and reflecting on those experiences, making meaning of things that I think is just a really critical but way too often neglected piece of supporting holistic social and emotional development in human beings.
I love that. And recently I had Darren Graves, who is a developmental psychologist, but he talks about youth critical consciousness development in youth. And one of the examples he gave, as the children were studying in their schools, the location, apparently one of the foreign countries' consulate had an advisory to people coming from that country to not go to the area of the city where their school was, because it was dangerous. But mainly it was predominantly Black and Latino population. And so these children investigated the population of their area. They actually read the policy or the advisory. They wrote a letter to the consulate general, and they took action. So it's exactly what you're talking about. That something is not even part of the curriculum if children are not given an opportunity to investigate the environment in which they are acting as agents, but agents of what? Learning what? Somebody else's agenda. And I think I always like to conceptualize that transition from adolescence into young adulthood is this passing the baton. I'm teaching you how to learn, and then you teach yourself whatever that you need to learn, right?
Right.
So as we come to a close, this has been a fantastic conversation. And with your brilliant mind, I'm sure many, many things have shaped your thought processes. Are there anything that you have read that has been powerful, influential, or meaningful to you that you can share with us?
Yeah, it's so hard to pick a thing.
I know.
And I'll say that in part because so much of my own thinking gets woven together across reading a broad number of things, and so more than any given book that I would recommend is that I would just really encourage people to read broadly across any particular area. And so, for example, a lot of my thinking comes from reading history of education and the history of high schools, and 100 years ago, what was going on when high schools first went from being a very rare thing that 2 or 3% of the population attended high school to a place where most people were high school educated. And so reading history, reading philosophy, reading neuroscience, I think that the more people can read even just short articles about those various pieces and put those together, that certainly is how any of my own understanding of the world has come, is by reading very, very broadly across different perspectives on things.
I really appreciate that. I think that's become a polymath, is what you're saying. I think it's really broadens your perspective. I'm a big fan of, same as you said, one of the interesting, Vivian Zalazar, I don't know if you have read her book, Economically Useless and Emotionally Priceless. I think
I love the title.
that has been a very interesting book. She's a sociologist, about how did children become so priceless?
Mm-hmm,
And before that, children were losing limbs, and children were like dying because they were workers in the fields and factories.
Yes.
And then so I think those kinds of things give you a perspective about what is even the purpose of education is to not necessarily enlightenment. It was mostly getting them to become workers. So
that's right. No, I was fortunate in that my undergraduate studies. Well, first I had a string of different majors, so I read a lot of different things, but I ended up with a degree in women's studies, which was an interdisciplinary subject, and so I think I have always taken a really interdisciplinary approach to my work, and that has certainly helped inform my thinking and develop my kind of intellectual tradition, as well as to understand how I think the historical perspective as well. So like things that we're grappling with now, like what are the various places, both the antecedents to this and then the various places in history where folks have grappled with some of the same issues.
Well, that brings us to the end of this conversation. Thank you, Camille. You've been absolutely fabulous. This has been a great conversation. Thank you for tuning in, everybody. Keep listening. If you love what you listen, please share and subscribe to our newsletter. Like us on our social media. I hate to say that. Just letting you know, we are on social media. And keep in touch. Thank you for taking a deep interest in preparing the youth and really understanding the deep factors that contribute in shaping or that has shaped ourselves, and maybe we can be influential in the development and growth of many. Thank you again for being here. With that, see you until next time.
Thank you so much, Sucheta.
Thank you for listening to Full Prefrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. To contact your host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive function, visit her website at exqinfiniteknowhow.com. That's www.exqinfiniteknowhow.com. Tune in next week for another informative episode of Full Prefrontal, hosted by the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.